All right, whole Bible readers, week 43. We are in the final 10 weeks of the program, and this week is going to take us through Paul's letter to the Romans, the longest letter in the New Testament, and it's the first one we're going to read because that's the way our New Testament is organized, with the letters of Paul at the beginning, with the letters of Paul to churches at the beginning of the beginning, and going from longest to shortest. Now, Romans is famous for its dense theological argumentation, but as you read, keep in mind that Romans is really about how we apply the gospel to a problem that the Roman church faced, which was the division, the inability to get along between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. So how does Paul do that? Let's take it kind of section by section, mostly chapter by chapter. In chapter 1, after some preliminaries and stating his thesis that the gospel is God's power to salvation for all who believe, the Jew first and also the Greek or the Gentile, then Paul says for the rest of the chapter, hey, Gentiles are terrible, and here's the evidence that he gives. But then in chapter 2, he says, hey, Jews, let's not think too highly of ourselves because we're terrible too, as our scriptures remind us, as our history reminds us. So chapter 3, and Paul uses a whole litany of texts from the Old Testament here to say, everyone is a sinner. Many of us have memorized, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, from Romans chapter 3. But in chapter 3, Paul also says God's solution is the atoning sacrifice that Jesus gives, because this enables God to be just, rightly punishing sin, but also justifier, the one who is merciful and forgives sins. Now, chapter 4 says this is no innovation, that God didn't make this up as a plan B. It's always been his plan. It's always been his promise. In fact, from the time of Abraham, Abraham was counted as righteous, not because he was circumcised, like the Jews, but because of his faith, which is the sequence in which it happens in the book of Genesis. So chapter 5 says this is now a kind of a comprehensive solution to the situation of humanity. It transforms our present existence, and it reaches clear back to the beginning of time to change the direction of human history. Chapters 6 and 7 then show us that we're freed not just from the penalty of sin, but from the power of sin, because through the gospel we are empowered to live a resurrected life with a new master in a new relationship with God, overcoming our inability to do the thing that we wanted to do, that we aspired to do before. And chapter 8 shows us that the power of that comes from the Holy Spirit, through whom we are participating right now in God's renewal of the world. God is taking his world back, and the Spirit is at work in us, bringing that about. Well, chapters 9 to 11 argue that this is not something which should be seen as God breaking a promise or turning his back on the people of Israel. Yes, there were many of Paul's contemporaries who didn't believe, but Paul's point is to say it is God's sovereign choice to make believers his by faith. So no one's in a position to criticize that. And in fact, the door is always open to Jewish believers, to anyone, to believe the gospel and so join God's people, which he pictures as an olive tree. And so in this way, all Israel, that is the true people of God, will be saved. Chapters 12 to 14 kind of put this into practice. Be transformed by the renewing of your minds so that you live in love and peace with one another. You live in harmony with your community, and you are always deferring to other people, not seeking your own interests, but seeking other people's interests. This is how the unity of the church can be achieved, not by avoiding conflict, but by caring more about others than we do about ourselves. So in chapter 15, Paul will summarize all of this as he gives some personal updates, but in particular says, welcome one another, in the name of Christ, and by that, glorify God. Now, chapter 16 is interesting because even though Paul had never been to Rome, well, Rome is a busy place. A little bit in my mind like Champaign-Urbana, where the whole world seems eventually to come. So Paul knows lots of people there, and he gives greetings to them. They're high people and they're low people as well. An amazing way that the church comes together, always in that way. Well, we will begin 1 Corinthians towards the end of the week. The Corinthian church has problems. In fact, all of the letters that Paul writes are to churches with problems. And the first problem that Paul addresses in 1 Corinthians is the way that this church was divided up as people sort of pick sides. Who was their favorite church leader? Well, Paul says, this is nonsense. Stop acting selfishly like a worldly person. You know the true Christ. Your loyalty is to him, and you should be transformed into his image. Now, I think it's worth remembering the Roman church had problems, the Corinthian church had problems. All of the churches that Paul wrote to have problems. If you've lived through church problems, you are not alone, and the Bible is for you. It's there to address those. Happy reading this week.